Today you'll learn the real truth about KGB psychiatric hospitals. If you didn't know, in reality, not according to documents, all psychiatry was handled by the KGB and they used it for their dirty purposes. You will learn how the authorities punished people not through investigation and court, but simply by declaring them insane. The Soviet regime simply punished the country's residents for actions that did not constitute a crime and were not offenses even according to Soviet law. The Soviet system deliberately turned a normal, sane person into a real madman. The topic is so unpleasant but necessary to understand the criminal nature of the USSR. My name is Semyon, Megashot TV channel. Let's begin. What was Soviet psychiatry like? To begin with, let's point out a very important detail. In the USSR, science had entirely different functions than in Western countries. In a free democratic society, the main task of science was to meet people's needs and improve their living and working conditions. That is, in the West, scientists worked in accordance with people's interests, which cannot be said at all about Soviet science. It served the interests of the totalitarian state, was completely controlled by the ruling ideology and by the decisions of dictators. This often led to tragic and completely absurd consequences. For example, during the time of Stalin, genetics and cybernetics were declared bourgeois pseudosciences, and their followers were subjected to brutal repression. For example, academician Nikolai Vavilov. And although after the death of the bloody tyrant these bans were lifted, it still had a detrimental effect on the overall level of development of the USSR and determined its technological lag behind the West. As a result, by the 1970s, the Soviet Union's lag in computer technology was so serious that it had to buy the necessary parts and microchips on the black market, or simply steal all that know-how from Western countries. Well, today we're going to talk about another science, psychiatry. That is the science that dealt with treating pathologies, deviations, and disorders. But psychology, which specialized in providing help to ordinary people, simply didn't exist. There were no psychologists in the USSR, only psychiatrists. And this was despite the fact that in the mid-20th century in the United States, psychologists were one of the most in-demand and prestigious professions. For most large companies, it became the norm to have a psychologist on staff. But that's only half the trouble. The thing is, psychiatry in the USSR was not so much about treatment, but rather had a punitive focus. In other words, people weren't really being helped. They were isolated from society with an emphasis on their unfitness, uselessness, and worthlessness. This attitude towards sick people, many of whom were actually quite healthy, was clearly evident even in Soviet films. For example, in the well-known comedy Kidnapping Caucasian Style. But the most shocking thing was that in the USSR, psychiatry was used for political purposes. Against dissidents, people with different views, or those who simply doubted the fairness of the Soviet system and the decisions of its leaders. Nowadays, such people are called critical thinkers, but under a totalitarian regime, they were considered extremely dangerous. It was precisely to deal with such overly intelligent citizens that special medical institutions were created, better known as KGB psychiatric hospitals. Why a psychiatric hospital and not the GULAG? Our dear viewers might ask a perfectly logical question: why bother creating these psychiatric hospitals? Wouldn't it have been easier to send someone who disagreed with the party line to the camps for re-education for, say, 15 years? Or at least just shoot him? But that's exactly the point. The KGB psychiatric hospital was a simple and cheap way to deal with dissent, so they wouldn't have to bother much. The thing is, during Stalin's time, it was easy to send a Soviet person to Siberia or have them shot. But during Khrushchev's time, and even more so under Brezhnev, it was necessary to at least maintain the formal appearance of legality. Especially since the criminal code adopted in 1960 sharply limited the number of articles punishable by execution. And the terms of imprisonment for other cases, including political ones, were significantly limited. However, there was a universal article on anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda which allowed a person to be imprisoned for up to 7 years. And if you were caught again, then up to 10 years. By the way, most dissidents were imprisoned under this article, for example Vasily Stus and Vyacheslav Chernovol. However, in order to process and bring such a case to court, you need at least some evidence, preferably physical evidence. For example, a collection of poems criticizing the Soviet regime and Soviet leaders, or banned socialist revolutionary literature that was secretly brought in from the West. But what if, during a search, nothing like that was found? Should the case be built solely on confessions that were previously forced out of the suspect? In the 1930s, that would have easily worked, but not in the 1960s and not in the 1980s. And then, a wonderful institution called the Psychoneurological Special Institution of Closed Legality would come to the aid of the unfortunate investigator. In practice, it looked like this. Dissidents were usually handled by the 5th Directorate of the KGB. By the way, that's where Putin began his career. Therefore, I strongly recommend watching our video about the valiant service of the Kremlin dwarf in the state security agencies, which, upon closer inspection, turned out not to be so valiant after all. So, if the security officers couldn't gather any kind of evidence, they would declare that person insane. They processed it quickly and efficiently without any unnecessary paperwork, prosecutors, or lawyers. A commission of 3 psychiatrists who wore KGB officer uniforms under their white coats would declare the arrested person insane. Then, this decision was sent to the nearest people's court, where the judge would stamp the necessary order for compulsory hospitalization within 5 minutes. The patient himself was not present. Well, why bother? A lunatic is a lunatic. What can you expect from him? The legal basis for such repressions was the instruction on the emergency hospitalization of psychiatric patients who pose a public danger, approved by the Ministry of Health of the USSR on October 10, 1961, under number 0414/32. It effectively legalized extrajudicial deprivation of freedom and violence against people's health at the whim of the authorities. According to this document, a patient could be placed in a psychiatric hospital without their consent and without the consent of their relatives or guardians if there was an obvious danger to others or to themselves. If we take into account that, according to the criminal code in force at that time, the category of socially dangerous acts considered especially dangerous to society. Of course, this included anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, as well as the dissemination of knowingly false fabrications that discredited the Soviet state and social system. Then it's not hard to guess that any dissenter could be declared mentally ill. So it's quite possible to rephrase the famous saying from the Soviet era, if there's a person, a diagnosis will always be found. What methods and treatments were used in that psychiatric hospital? So, a person ended up in a KGB psychiatric hospital, and what awaited him, what kind of treatment, and how long could he stay there? Let's start with the last question. A person's confinement in such an institution was completely unlimited. It could last a year or even 10. In contrast, colonies had court-specified sentences. For psychiatric patients, things were simpler. They would be treated for as long as necessary, until the state security doctors declared the person healthy and sent them for discharge. And being healthy meant not being dangerous to the Soviet totalitarian machine. In other words, not being able to express your opinion, protest, or argue. A wide range of medical services was used to achieve these goals. Most often, they injected a drug called sulfazine, which caused a sharp rise in body temperature, immobility, fever, and after the acute phase, a suppressed and even depressive state. That's exactly what the doctors were aiming for. In the West, for example, sulfazine was banned back in the 1960s due to its low effectiveness and a bunch of side effects. But in the USSR, such details didn't interest anyone. A milder option was aminazine, which, although it suppressed a person's will and turned them into something of a vegetable, did not cause as strong a dependency as sulfazine. It should also be noted that in such psychiatric hospitals, straitjackets were hardly ever used. Injections served their purpose. After the injection, the arms would drop lifelessly along the body, the legs would become weak, the joints would contort, and the patient was no longer dangerous. Orderlies often beat the patients as well, sometimes just for fun. Yes, and one more important point about the diagnosis that was given to such patients. Soviet psychiatry also showed remarkable inventiveness here, specifically introducing a new type of psychiatric disorder into scientific use called sluggish schizophrenia, meaning hidden schizophrenia. In fact, this meant that a person might appear completely healthy on the outside, but doctors believed that he was simply carefully hiding his illness, disguising himself as a normal person. It's a perfect diagnosis for dissidents. A person is healthy, but in reality he's actually sick. Sick for Soviet society, which is tirelessly building communism. Some people have endured the horrors of psychiatric hospitals. The exact number of people who have been behind the walls of KGB psychiatric hospitals is unknown. There is still no official data. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many former patients of such institutions preferred to keep quiet, fearing judgment and ridicule from others. Being in a labor camp is very different from being in a psychiatric hospital. Who would bother to understand the terms and diagnoses or listen to the fact that in reality there is no such thing as sluggish schizophrenia? And all of this is nothing more than an invention of punitive Soviet psychiatry. The most famous of them was the human rights activist, writer, commentator, and public figure Vladimir Bukovsky. In fact, thanks to his numerous articles and interviews in the West, the general public first learned about such a barbaric method of punishment as forced psychiatry. Bukovsky spent a total of 12 years in treatment for organizing anti-Soviet demonstrations and other protest actions. And only in 1976 was he exchanged by the authorities for the imprisoned leader of the Chilean Communist Party, Luis Carvalhan, and settled in the United Kingdom. By the way, an interesting fact, even after the collapse of the USSR, Bukovsky continued to criticize the Russian authorities for excessive authoritarianism and condemned Putin's rise to power. And for a long time, along with Boris Nemtsov, Garry Kasparov, and Yevgeny Kiselyov, he was one of the founders of the anti-Putin opposition. And shortly before his death in 2019, Bukovsky claimed the following: Russia must go through a period of collapse and fragmentation. It must develop regional self-government which Putin has suppressed. Without this huge country will not survive. Otherwise, it will always be a centralized dictatorship or some kind of federation where everything is decided through partnership and agreements, not by orders from above. And when individual subjects of the federation are able to establish their own self-government, then they will be able to agree on a confederation. And until that happens, there will always be the temptation to slide into a rigid hierarchical vertical. This system does not tolerate democracy. Another well-known patient of the special clinics was the fighter for the rights of the Crimean Tatar people and supporter of the democratization of the Soviet state, Major General Petr Grigorenko. The authorities did not want to hold an open trial against the war hero, so they quietly got rid of him by declaring him insane, at the same time stripping him of all his ranks and awards. Such treatment caused irreparable harm to Grigorenko's health. When in 1977, under pressure from the international community, he was allowed to emigrate to the United States, he was already a seriously ill man. 10 years later, he died, never having returned to his homeland. It is also worth mentioning the poet and Nobel Prize laureate in literature, Joseph Brodsky. However, he didn't spend much time in psychiatric hospitals, since the authorities eventually decided to sentence him to 5 years under the law against parasitism. But the impressions of these institutions stayed with him for the rest of his life, as he considered them even worse than any Soviet labor camp. Let's think and draw our own conclusions. In short, by declaring undesirable people mentally ill, the Soviet authorities could isolate them in psychiatric hospitals without a trial, without attracting the attention of the international community and the noise that would come with it. At the same time, they could cynically claim that, unlike the damned decaying West, the prosperous USSR practiced the most humane approach possible. After all, a dissident citizen in such cases was considered a patient who needed treatment, not a criminal subject to criminal punishment. That's the kind of merciful and fair Soviet justice they had. Overall, it should be noted that the use of forced psychiatry in the USSR made it possible to suppress any manifestations of dissent, while maintaining the illusion of legality in their actions. Diagnoses like sluggish schizophrenia were often given to people who criticized the Soviet regime, advocated for human rights, or distributed banned literature. Therefore, KGB psychiatric hospitals turned into an instrument of political repression hidden behind the facade of medical care. It's real rot in a beautiful shell. Well, that's all from me. Goodbye, everyone.